Hey everyone, it's Zach with Palantir Research. Got a new article out about tech companies and the businesses surrounding that are playing a role in the Ukraine war. But note, this is an opinion piece that does try to dive into the mindset of these business leaders and of course Ukraine's side on what they're doing and how these companies are actually helping them in the war against the Russian invasion. Palantir is only briefly mentioned here specifically with a quote from Dr. Alex Karp, so I'll of course cover that, but we get more insight on the expectation of Ukraine's leadership on the role of these tech companies in the war and more importantly after the war. So let's dive right in. And briefly for context here, just to catch everyone up, here's everything at a high level what they've been doing in Ukraine so far for those who are new to Palantir. I know there are a lot who started following the company as the price ran up, but either way, they have been heavily involved, allowing Ukraine to utilize their software for free in two major ways first, and that is the relocation and management of Ukrainian refugees across Europe on the humanitarian side, but also on the targeting algorithm side on the military part. And there's a great piece from Time, which I did a previous video on if you want to check that out, that has much more detail on the experience of meta constellations and coordination of edge AI, of not only satellite data, but everything else to determine targeting, and then using an Uber-like delivery system to deliver different artillery crews instructions on the different targets and what actions to follow through on. So it's not fully automated from start to finish, targeting to the point of pulling the trigger, but you get the idea here where there's a human element still at play, which is actually what Palantir wants to happen. And there was also a press release that Palantir will be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine, most likely starting with infrastructure and then becoming a tech hub, of course, eventually. But we get a little more details in this new article as well at what leadership is trying to do. And finally, the sponsorship for their female tennis star, Alina Svitolina. Palantir is just very involved now there, even on the military side, but also on the civilian side and commercial side, potentially in the future. I'm assuming that's from the partnership just to get them more name recognition. So the article itself here that we're covering today starts out pretty mild, but essentially they're setting up where Ukraine is now with implementing a lot of technology on the battlefield. A lot of this is coming from both the civilian and military side being tested in the battlefield. But the author does point out that drones are being used for scouting and helping clear the fog of war on the battlefield. AI is used to help with labeling targets, which has been widely talked about by Alex Karp publicly and what I talked about in the Times article. And one other use case I didn't know was the facial recognition system being used to identify fallen Russian soldiers. And drones have been a massive part of this war here, not only for Ukraine, but also Russia, where it is used for dropping explosives, but also reconnaissance, of course. The article does reference other tech companies like Google and Clearview, but just focusing on Palantir here. She paints Alex Karp as perverse in his enthusiasm for testing out new products, following that sentence with his claims that Palantir is making a decisive difference in favor of Ukraine with their targeting. Alex Karp was one of the first Western CEOs to visit, and he's quoted as saying the power of advanced algorithmic warfare systems is now so great that it equates to having tactical nuclear weapons against an adversary with only conventional ones. And of course, we've seen this here with Ukraine still standing when everyone thought it was probably going to take a few days. At least this is from top leadership on the US side. And in reality, Ukraine is here more than a year later. Now, I'll give her credit that she's not bashing Palantir here per se and does just give out some general information, but at least gives them publicity into what they're doing and not just calling them a spy company like other kinds of journalists. But for the Palantir section, that's pretty much it. And it's focused on that larger narrative about businesses and Ukraine. But we go on to something more interesting later at the end of the article, where we get insight into the expectations of Ukraine's leadership. Ukrainian officials want these companies that are helping them also to have a lasting positive impact on the country, of course. That seems like a no-brainer. Looking ahead to producing a tech hub of their own like Silicon Valley, to be a bastion of innovation in tech, but also in military technologies to help them defend in the future. So it really sounds like this is for the long haul, and Palantir, at least in my mind, has made it very clear they are reliable coming in so quickly during a tough time. And geographically, this makes sense, being at the border of Russia and being surrounded by NATO countries, but also they want to go off the Israeli model here. Now, here I'll leave that up to you as an individual viewer if you think that's a good or bad thing for Ukraine, but knowing what we know now, some of the strongest and scariest military technology has come from Israel. And also, this is from Fedorov, who spoke alongside Alex Karp on the ways they're utilizing technology on the battlefield. He's a major official in the Zelensky administration, and I would expect him to stick around if Ukraine stays standing for the reconstruction of their country, especially when it comes to the technology end, which is actually how he moved his way up so quickly. But either way, It closes out the article here on that note that they need to stave off the Russian invasion first to defend the country until they can get to the point of their people starting companies. Now, in my opinion, this is always great to hear the positive reinforcement that companies are contributing to Ukraine, and Palantir being one of them, of course, and being one of the earliest. We know it's at least worth something to show up in their time of need and let them use the software for free. Of course, Palantir does get stuff out of here, more experience with their kind of battle-tested software. And of course, Ukraine gets something out of it when it's free. And as a Palantir investor, I think this is great PR, obviously, and shows NATO, who has expanded so quickly with 2 new members recently of Finland and Sweden, with one of the longest land borders, of course, with Russia. But as noted, the country of Ukraine still needs to be stabilized first before any major business can be done on the reconstruction side. But also financially, it is still a black box of how big of a deal this is for Palantir. Will it be worth just millions or tens of millions, or is it potentially hundreds of millions or billions of dollars? Plus, with the potential compounding effect of NATO expansion and nearby allies wanting to use Palantir. I know there's still a lot of information we don't know here as investors, but this article shows Palantir is still viewed favorably when it comes to at least the war in Ukraine. But what are your thoughts though on all this? Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next video.